Kneel down and clean it with your apron, or I'll make sure your brother never leaves that ICU room alive." I didn't move. I just looked at the $5,000 suit I'd supposedly ruined with a splash of coffee, and then at the man wearing it.
Fint deg, Mac.
He didn't just want an apology. He wanted to see me break. He handed the hospital administrator a signed discharge form while he stood there, smiling like he'd already erased my brother's future. That's the moment I need you to understand first. Not because it was the moment my world ended, but because it wasn't. Not even close. 2 hours before I walked into that hospital hallway, I'd made a phone call I promised I'd never make, a call to a man whose name makes cities tremble. I just hadn't played my hand yet. Hey besties. Welcome back to the channel. If you're ready to see a corporate bully get what's coming to him, hit that subscribe button. Let us know where you're watching from. Is it morning or night for you? Now let's get back to the takedown. I was standing next to the nursing station when the elevator dinged. That's the detail that stuck. Not the smell of antiseptic that usually chokes me. Not the constant, rhythmic beep 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 of the heart monitors behind the glass. Not the way the hospital staff went unnaturally still the second he stepped out, like prey sensing a wolf. It was my hands. They were shaking, but not from fear. I'd just finished a 12-hour double shift. My shoes were worn through at the soles. My black apron was heavy with the grime of 1,000 tables. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just trying to buy one more day of oxygen for my brother. Then the doors opened. Tamak stepped out wearing a watch that cost more than the ICU wing, holding a stack of legal papers and a smirk I wanted to rip off his face. He looked different, calm in a way that felt like a death sentence. He didn't come alone. Behind him, leaning against the door frame like he owned the building because through a series of shell companies he actually did, was the man who'd been making my life a living hell for months. 3 years of him treating me like a footstool. 3 years of, "Hey, sweetheart," in a tone that meant I was nothing. He was standing there, watching my brother's life hang by a thread, and all he could talk about was the stain on his sleeve. My brain tried to find a way to pay him off, but I found nothing. "We need to do this now," Tamak said, his voice flat and clean, like he was ordering a drink. He slid the discharge papers across the administrator's desk. I didn't touch them. "Tamak," my voice came out steadier than I expected. "He's still unconscious. You can't do this." He folded his arms, his expensive watch catching the harsh fluorescent light. "I'm being honest, finally. You're a waitress, Mia. You work constantly, and you're still behind on every bill. You come here exhausted, smelling like old grease, talking about one more day like it's a victory." He exhaled, looking at the ICU sign behind me. "This isn't a life, Mia. This is a tragedy." The way he said my name sounded like the end of a long, tired joke. "I've been trying," I said. "I know," he glanced back at his men. "That's exactly the problem. This is your best. And your best isn't enough to stay in my world." And just like that, every humiliation I'd swallowed, every night I'd cried in the break room, and every time I'd told myself I could survive this without my father's help, it all clicked into one ugly, perfect picture. He thought he was the apex predator. He had no idea he was standing in the shadow of a ghost. The alarm clock on Mia's nightstand didn't just beep. It felt like a hammer hitting an anvil inside her head. It was 4 a.m., and the room was still pitch black. She reached out, her fingers searching for the button, and for a moment, she let her hand stay there, resting on the cold plastic. Every muscle in her body ached. Her legs felt heavy, like they were made of lead, a souvenir from the 12-hour shift she had finished only a few hours ago. She sat up slowly, her feet hitting the cold floorboards. Beside her bed was a stack of envelopes. She didn't need to open them to know what they said. The red ink on the outside was enough. Final notice. Past due.
Urgent.
They were all for Leo, her younger brother. The hospital where he lay in the ICU didn't care that Mia was working 2 jobs. They didn't care that she skipped meals to save a few extra dollars. They only cared about the numbers on the screen. Mia splashed cold water on her face, trying to wake up her tired eyes. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized the girl looking back. Her skin was dull, and there were dark circles under her eyes that looked like bruises. She pulled her hair back into a tight, neat bun and pinned her name tag to her white shirt.
Mia.
Just a name. Just a waitress. The walk to the first diner was a blur of gray streets and chilly wind. By 6 a.m., she was balancing 3 plates of steaming eggs and bacon on her left arm while pouring coffee with her right. The diner was loud and crowded. People shouted their orders, complained about the toast being too cold, and hurried away without looking at her. She moved like a machine, back and forth, from the kitchen to the tables, her mind constantly counting. That table left a $5 tip. That's half a gallon of gas. This table left nothing. That's 10 minutes of work wasted. By noon, the first shift ended, but Mia didn't go home. She took a bus across town to the hospital. The smell of the hospital always made her stomach turn, a mix of floor wax and medicine that signaled trouble. She walked past the gift shop, her eyes lingering on a stuffed bear that Leo would have loved, but she kept walking. She couldn't afford a toy when she could barely afford his oxygen. Inside the ICU, the world was quiet except for the steady, rhythmic thump hiss of the ventilators. Leo looked so small in the big hospital bed. Tubes and wires covered his chest, connecting him to machines that were the only thing keeping him in this world. Mia sat by his side and took his hand. It was thin and pale, but it was still warm. "Hey, Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I worked the breakfast rush today. It was crazy. I think I broke a land speed record for serving pancakes." She tried to smile, but her face felt stiff. She stayed for 30 minutes, the only 30 minutes of her day, where she wasn't running. She told him about the weather and the funny dog she saw on the bus, pretending that everything was normal. But the whole time, she was looking at the monitor, watching the blue line of his heartbeat. Every beat was a gift, but every beat also cost money she didn't have. A nurse tapped on the glass door, holding a clipboard. Mia knew what was coming. It was the daily update from the billing office. "The balance is growing, Mia," the nurse said softly. She looked sorry, but sorry didn't pay the bills. "The administration is asking about the payment plan again. They said if the minimum isn't met by Friday." "I know," Mia interrupted, her voice a little too sharp. "I'm working on it. I have another shift starting in an hour." She kissed Leo's forehead and stood up. Her back gave a sharp, painful twinge, but she ignored it. She tucked the new bill into her bag and walked out of the room. She didn't look back. If she looked back, she might not be able to leave, and if she didn't leave, she couldn't earn. The second shift was at a high-end lounge owned by the syndicate. It was a place of silk curtains and expensive cigars, a place where people spent more on a single bottle of wine than Mia made in a month. She traded her diner apron for a black one, her face becoming a mask of polite service. Her feet were throbbing now, a dull, pulsing pain that moved up to her hips. She was exhausted, the kind of tired that makes your brain feel foggy and slow. But she kept moving. She carried trays of crystal glasses and wiped down marble tables, always watching the clock. Every hour was a step closer to Leo's safety. Every dollar was a breath for her brother. She was a daughter of a king who had vanished, living the life of a ghost, and as the night began to roar to life around her, Mia felt like she was disappearing into the shadows of the very world she had tried to escape. As Tamok's cold fingers gripped her chin, the harsh lights of the lounge seemed to fade away. The thumping music and the smell of cigars disappeared, replaced by a memory so sharp it felt like it was happening all over again. Suddenly, Mia wasn't a waitress in a stained apron. She was a 10-year-old girl standing in the middle of a room that was too big and too quiet. The mansion had always felt more like a museum than a home. Everything was made of white marble and gold. The floors were so shiny that Mia could see her own frightened face reflecting in them as she stood by the massive front doors. It was a rainy night, just like the night Leo had been born, and the sound of the storm lashed against the tall windows. At the end of the long hallway stood her father, Elias. To the rest of the world, he was the ghost, a man whose name was whispered in fear by every criminal in the city. To Mia, he was just a man who sat in the shadows and gave orders that made people disappear. He was wearing a heavy black coat, looking down at her with eyes that were as hard as flint. If you walk out that door, Mia, you walk out with nothing, Elias had said. His voice didn't shake. He didn't sound sad. He sounded like he was making a business deal. You will have no name. You will have no protection. You will be just another girl in a world that eats people like you. Mia had gripped the handle of her small suitcase until her knuckles turned white. Beside her, her mother was already waiting in the shadows of the porch, holding a tiny, bundled-up Leo. They were leaving the silk sheets and the private security. They were leaving the family business because Mia's mother wanted her children to grow up with clean hands. She didn't want them to learn that power came from the end of a gun. I don't want your protection, Dad, Mia had whispered, her voice small but firm. I don't want to live in a house built on tears. I'd rather be hungry and free than full and afraid. Elias didn't move to stop her. He didn't even reach out to touch her hair. He simply stepped back into the darkness of his study. The world is a cruel place for those who have no power, Mia. One day, you will realize that being good doesn't pay for bread. You'll come back. They always come back. I will never come back, Mia vowed. She had turned her back on the gold leaf ceilings and the men in suits who bowed whenever she walked by. She had stepped out into the rain, feeling the cold water soak through her thin jacket, and for a long time, she believed she had won. For 10 years, she had kept that promise. She had changed her last name. She had worked every low-paying job she could find, from cleaning floors to flipping burgers. She had watched her mother work herself to exhaustion until she passed away, leaving Mia to take care of Leo alone. She had been hungry, she had been cold, and she had been tired, but she had stayed away. She had kept her hands clean. But now, as Tamok's hand tightened on her face, his eyes mocking her poverty, the memory of her father's voice came back to haunt her. The world is a cruel place for those who have no power. Tamok was exactly the kind of man her father had warned her about. He was the kind of man who thought he could own people just because he had money in his pocket and a title on his business card. He was using the very power Mia had run away from to crush her. Mia snapped back to the present. The lounge was cold, and the coffee stain on Tamok's sleeve looked like a dark bruise. She looked at him, and for a split second, she didn't see a scary Mafia boss. She saw a small, arrogant boy playing with a fire he didn't understand. She had spent a decade trying to be nobody, but Tamok was making it impossible to stay that way. The secret she had buried deep in her heart was starting to burn, and she realized that the ghost she had tried to leave behind was still living inside her blood. The next morning, Mia arrived at the lounge early, hoping to apologize again or perhaps offer to work for free until the suit was paid off. But the heavy glass doors didn't open for her. Instead, the manager, a man who usually looked at her with pity, stood behind the glass with his arms crossed. He didn't even let her inside. He just slid a small white envelope through the crack in the door. "You're done, Mia," he said, not looking her in the eye. "Tamok made the call. He didn't just fire you. He put your name on the do not hire list for every club and restaurant in the district. No one is going to give you a job, not even to wash dishes." Mia felt like the air had been sucked out of her lungs. "But my brother, the bills." "I'm sorry," the manager whispered, finally looking at her. "But you know how it works. When someone like Tamok wants you gone, you disappear. It's safer for everyone if you just leave." She walked away, her footsteps heavy on the pavement. She tried 3 other diners on her way to the hospital, but it was like a ghost was following her. At each place, the owners took one look at her name and shook their heads. Tamok had moved fast. He was using his power to choke her life out, one door at a time. He wanted her to feel the weight of what it meant to be a nobody. When she finally reached the hospital, she headed straight for the ICU, but she was stopped at the nursing station. The head nurse, who was usually kind, held up a hand. Her face was pale, and she looked worried. "Mia, I'm so sorry, but there's been a problem with Leo's account," the nurse said. "I have the money from yesterday," Mia said, reaching for her bag. "It's not much, but it's something." "It's not about the cash," the nurse replied, lowering her voice. "An anonymous donor, who is helping with the ICU overhead costs, has withdrawn their support for Leo specifically. And when we tried to process your credit card for the daily insurance gap, it was declined." Not just declined. The company said the account was flagged for fraud and frozen. Mia's heart stopped. She knew exactly what had happened. Taemak didn't just control the clubs. His family had ties to the banks and the hospital board. He wasn't just taking her job. He was cutting the wires that kept Leo alive. What does that mean for Leo? Mia asked. Her voice was so quiet it was almost a whisper. The hospital administration has already signed the papers, the nurse said, her eyes filling with tears. Since his bill is now in total default and his credit is blocked, they are moving him out of the ICU. They are transferring him to a public ward in a different city. He might not survive the trip, Mia. He needs the machines here. Mia felt like the walls were closing in. She went to the ICU window and pressed her hand against the glass. Leo looked so peaceful, unaware that his world was being dismantled by a man who was angry about a coffee stain. She realized then that Taemak didn't just want her to be poor. He wanted to watch her lose the only thing she had left to love. She sat on a hard plastic chair in the waiting room, her head in her hands. She had tried to be good. She had tried to work hard and stay away from the darkness of her father's world. But the darkness had found her anyway. It had found her and was now squeezing the life out of her brother. She reached into her pocket and felt the small, crumpled piece of paper she had carried for 10 years. It was a phone number written in thick, black ink. She had promised herself she would never use it. She had promised her mother she would stay free. But as she heard the sound of a gurney being wheeled toward Leo's room to move him out, she realized that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Taemak had forced her into a corner, and there was only one person left who could get her out of it. With shaking fingers, she walked toward the payphone at the end of the hall. The payphone at the end of the hospital hallway felt like it was miles away. Mia's legs were shaking so much she had to lean against the cold, tiled wall to keep from falling. Every breath she took felt like she was swallowing broken glass. In the distance, she could see the heavy metal doors of the ICU. 2 orderlies were already moving toward Leo's room with a transport gurney. They were going to take him away, and she knew that once those doors closed behind him, he would never come back. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, yellowed piece of paper. The edges were frayed, and the ink had faded over the last 10 years, but the numbers were still clear. She had memorized them long ago, even though she had promised herself she would never let them cross her mind. She picked up the heavy receiver. The dial tone was a long, lonely hum that seemed to mock her. With a trembling finger, she pressed the buttons. 1, 2, 3. Each beep sounded like a heartbeat. She closed her eyes, and for a second, she was back in the rain, standing outside the mansion while her father watched her from the shadows. She had been so proud then. She had thought she was strong enough to survive the world on her own. But Taemak had shown her the truth. In a world of monsters, a girl with nothing was just prey. The phone rang once. Twice. On the 3rd ring, the line clicked open. There was no hello. There was no automated voice. There was only a deep, heavy silence that felt like a physical weight pressing against Mia's ear. She knew he was there. She could hear the slow, steady breathing of the man who had spent a decade waiting for this moment. Her throat felt tight, and for a heartbeat, she thought she might choke on her own tears. "I need you, Dad," she whispered. The words were small, but they felt like they shook the entire building. The silence on the other end lasted for what felt like an eternity. Mia watched as the orderlies entered Leo's room. They were beginning to unhook the monitors. The panic rose up in her chest, hot and terrifying. "Where are you?" The voice was like a low rumble of thunder. It was the same voice from her nightmares and her memories. It was Elias. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't ask about the last 10 years. He didn't ask why she was calling now. He didn't need to. He was the ghost, and he already knew the answer was life or death. St. Jude's Hospital. Mia sobbed, her hand clutching the phone cord so tight her knuckles turned white. The ICU. They're taking Leo. They're taking him because a man named Taemak. "Don't say another word," Elias interrupted. His voice was no longer just a rumble. It was a cold, sharp blade. "Stay exactly where you are. Stand in front of your brother's door. Do not let them move him. Not 1 inch. But the guards, the administration. I am coming, Mia, Elias said. The finality in his voice was so strong that the fear in Mia's heart suddenly went still. The world is about to remember who I am, and they're about to learn who you are. The line went dead. Mia hung up the phone and turned around. She didn't feel like the tired, broken waitress anymore. Something old and powerful was waking up inside her. She marched back down the hallway, her worn-out shoes clicking loudly on the tiles. The orderlies were just about to wheel Leo's bed out into the hall. The head nurse was standing there with a look of deep sadness, holding the transfer papers. Stop,
Mia shouted.
her voice echoed off the walls, startling everyone in the hallway. Mia, please, we don't have a choice, the nurse said, her voice trembling. The board of directors gave the order. We have to move him now. No, Mia said, stepping directly in front of the bed and spreading her arms wide. She looked at the orderlies, and for the first time, her eyes weren't lowered in shame. They were bright with a cold, fierce light. You aren't moving him. Not for the board, not for Tamak, and not for anyone else. Get the security guards, one of the orderlies muttered, looking annoyed. As they reached for their radios, a strange sound began to fill the hospital. It started as a low vibration in the floor and grew into a roar. Outside the large glass windows of the lobby, a fleet of black SUVs was screaming into the parking lot. They didn't park. They skidded to a halt, blocking the main entrance. The hospital staff rose. The doctors at the nursing station turned their heads toward the front doors. Through the glass, Mia saw men in dark coats stepping out of the cars. Dozens of them. They moved with a military precision that made the hospital's own security guards drop their radios in fear. At the center of it all, a tall man in a heavy, dark overcoat stepped onto the sidewalk. He didn't look like a ghost anymore. He looked like a storm. Mia watched as her father walked toward the doors, and she knew that the 10-year war she had been fighting against herself was finally over. She had called the king back to his throne, and God help anyone who stood in his way. The air in the ICU hallway was ice cold, and it wasn't just because of the air conditioning. Jean Tamak walked down the corridor like he was walking onto a stage. The polished floor reflected his expensive shoes, and the clicking sound they made was steady and arrogant. He wasn't alone. 2 of his personal guards followed a few steps behind him, their faces like stone, making the hospital staff shrink back against the walls. Mia stood her ground in front of Leo's door. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but she didn't move. She could see the black SUVs through the distant lobby windows, and she knew her father was close. But right now, Tamak was the one standing in front of her. Still here, Mia? Tamak asked. He stopped a few feet away and looked at his fingernails, pretending to be bored.
I'm surprised.
I thought you would have been halfway to the bus station by now. You're very stubborn for someone who has nothing left. I told you he isn't moving, Mia said. Her voice was thin, but it didn't shake. Tamak let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a cruel sound that echoed off the white walls. He stepped closer, entering Mia's personal space until she could smell the expensive mint on his breath again. He looked over her shoulder at the machines inside the room. Look at this place, he whispered, gesturing to the expensive monitors and the high-tech bed. This room costs more per hour than you make in a month at that greasy diner. You think you can just stay here because you want to? The world doesn't work on wants. It works on power. And right now, I have all of it. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his inner pocket and tapped it against his palm. This is the final eviction notice. The hospital board has already been paid to look the other way. In 5 minutes, my men are going to wheel that bed out of here, and you are going to be left standing in the parking lot with nothing but your pride. You're a monster, Mia hissed. Tamak didn't look insulted. He looked delighted.
I'm a businessman, Mia.
You broke my property, so I'm breaking yours. That's a fair trade in my world. You chose to live like a servant, so don't be surprised when you get treated like one. He turned to the 2 orderlies who were still standing nearby, looking terrified. What are you waiting for? Move the bed. If she gets in the way, push through. She's just a waitress. She doesn't exist. The orderlies hesitated, looking at Mia's fierce expression, then at the two large guards standing behind Taemak. They started to move forward, their hands reaching for the brake locks on Leo's bed. "Don't touch him," Mia screamed, throwing her weight against the doorframe to block them. Taemak stepped back, watching the struggle with a smirk. He reached out and grabbed Mia's arm, his fingers digging into her skin to pull her away from the door.
Give it up, Mia.
"It's over. You lost the moment you spilled that coffee. You're just a girl in a cheap apron trying to fight a king." He was laughing now, a deep, mocking sound that filled the hallway. He felt completely safe. He felt like he had won. He was so busy enjoying Mia's desperation that he didn't notice the sudden silence that had fallen over the rest of the floor. He didn't notice that his own guards had suddenly gone stiff and pale. The light in the hallway seemed to dim as a massive shadow stretched across the floor, reaching all the way to Taemak's feet. The heavy double doors at the end of the ICU wing didn't just open. They seemed to groan under the weight of the man stepping through them. Taemak's laugh died in his throat. He felt a sudden, freezing chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the hospital air. He slowly let go of Mia's arm, his eyes widening as he looked past her. The hallway, which had felt like his kingdom only a second ago, suddenly felt very small and very dangerous. He didn't know it yet, but the nobody he was mocking was about to become the most protected person in the city, and the shadow behind him was the man who was going to take everything away. The silence that hit the hallway was so heavy it felt like the world had run out of air. Taemak stood frozen, his hand still hovering in the air where he had just been grabbing Mia's arm. He didn't turn around immediately, but his face transformed from a smirk of victory into a mask of pure terror. The color drained from his cheeks until he looked as white as the hospital walls. Behind him, the heavy thud of boots on the tiled floor echoed like a drum. Elias walked forward, his dark overcoat flowing behind him like a shadow come to life. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He moved with the slow, steady confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. Behind him stood a wall of men in gray suits, their faces stern and their eyes fixed on one target, the man who had laid a hand on the ghost's daughter. Taemak's two guards, men who had spent the whole night acting like tough giants, suddenly looked like frightened children. Without a single word being spoken, they took a step back and lowered their heads. Then, as if their legs had turned to jelly, they dropped to their knees. They didn't look at Taemak for orders. They didn't try to draw their weapons. They simply bowed to the man in the dark coat, their bodies trembling in the presence of a legend they had only heard about in whispers. Mia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She watched her father's face as he approached. Elias didn't look at the doctors or the nurses. He didn't even look at Leo's room yet. His eyes were locked onto Taemak. "I believe you were saying something about power," Elias said. His voice was low and raspy, like stones grinding together. It wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the hallway. Taemak finally forced himself to turn around. His knees knocked together, and he had to lean against the wall to keep from falling over. The prince of the city now looked like a peasant who had been caught stealing from a king's table. He tried to speak, but his throat was so dry that only a small, pathetic squeak came out. Master Elias," Taemak stammered, his voice cracking. I didn't know. I had no idea she belonged to you. I thought she was just a nobody." Elias stopped only 2 feet away from Taemak. He was much taller, and the shadow of his coat completely swallowed the younger man. He reached out a gloved hand and gently adjusted the collar of Taemak's expensive black suit, the same suit that had started this entire nightmare. "You thought she was a nobody because she worked for her bread?" Elias asked softly. Each word felt like a weight being dropped on the floor. "You thought that because she was humble, she was weak? You spent your night trying to crush a girl because of a stain on your sleeve. But you forgot the most important rule of the streets, Taemak." Taemak shook so hard his teeth began to chatter. Please, I can fix it. I'll pay for everything. I'll give her whatever she wants." "You have nothing I want," Elias replied. He looked at Taemak as if he were a bug he was about to step on. "You forgot that a lion's cub is still a lion, even if she chooses to walk in the dust. You laid your hands on my blood. You threatened my son's life to feed your own ego. The doctors and nurses stood in total disbelief. The man in the lab coat had his hands pressed to his face, his eyes wide as he realized that the waitress they had almost evicted was the daughter of a man who could buy and sell the entire hospital with a snap of his fingers. Elias turned his gaze to the orderlies who were still holding the brakes of Leo's bed. They let go of the metal frame as if it had turned into white-hot iron and scrambled away. Elias then looked at Mia. For a split second, the coldness in his eyes softened, replaced by a look of deep, quiet recognition. Tamok sank to the floor, his expensive suit wrinkling against the tiles as he joined his guards on his knees. He looked up at Elias, tears of pure fear finally spilling down his face. He realized that in this hallway, his money meant nothing. His title meant nothing. He was just a small, arrogant man who had made a fatal mistake. The king had returned to his throne, and the boy who thought he was a king was finally seeing the truth of his own smallness. The hospital hallway, which had once felt like a cage for Mia, now felt like a courtroom. Elias stood over Tamok, his presence filling the space until the air felt heavy. Tamok was still on his knees, his hands trembling as they pressed against the cold floor. He looked up at Elias, searching for even a tiny spark of mercy, but he found only a wall of stone. You like to talk about the cost of things, Tamok, Elias said, his voice quiet but echoing off the walls. You told my daughter she couldn't afford a single thread of your jacket. You told her she was an object that could be thrown away. Elias reached down and grabbed the lapel of Tamok's expensive black jacket. With one swift, powerful tug, the sound of expensive fabric ripping filled the hall. The seam at the shoulder burst open, leaving a jagged, ugly tear. Tamok gasped, his eyes wide, as if the ripping of the cloth was a physical wound. Take it off, Elias commanded. Master Elias, please, Tamok whispered, his voice cracking. It's a $5,000. Take it off, Elias repeated, his voice dropping an octave. With shaking hands, Tamok fumbled with the buttons. He slid the ruined jacket off his shoulders and let it fall into a heap on the dirty floor. Elias didn't stop there. He looked at the gold watch on Tamok's wrist, the one that had caught the light while he was mocking Mia's poverty. The watch. The shoes. The wallet, Elias said. Everything that makes you feel like a king. Give it to the girl you called a nobody. Tamok stripped off the watch and pulled the leather wallet from his pocket. He placed them on the floor in front of Mia. Finally, he kicked off his polished leather shoes, standing in his socks on the cold hospital tiles. He looked small and fragile without his expensive armor. He looked exactly like the person he had spent the whole night trying to destroy. Elias turned to one of his men. Call the bank. I want every account tied to the Jean family frozen by morning. Every club, every lounge, every car. If it has his name on it, it belongs to the ghost now. He wanted to blacklist my daughter? Now, the entire world will blacklist him. Tamok's face went from pale to a ghostly gray. He realized that Elias wasn't just taking his clothes, he was erasing his life. In a few minutes, he had gone from being a powerful boss to having less than the waitress he had humiliated. He had no money, no title, and no protection. Now, Elias said, leaning down so his face was only inches from Tamok's. You told her to kneel and clean a stain. Since you are so worried about dirt, you can start with this floor. Elias took the coffee-stained jacket from the floor and tossed it at Tamok's feet. Use this. Clean the hallway until I can see my reflection in the tiles. And if I see you look up, or if I hear you speak, I will make sure you never walk again. Tamok didn't hesitate. He grabbed the ruined silk jacket and began to scrub the floor, his movements frantic and desperate. The doctors and nurses watched in total silence as the man who had terrified them for hours worked on his knees, using a $5,000 coat as a rag. The arrogance was gone. The pride was gone. All that was left was a man who finally understood what it felt like to be treated like an object. Mia watched him, her heart heavy but still. She didn't feel joy in seeing him suffer, but she felt a deep sense of justice. She looked at her father, who stood like a guardian at the head of the hallway. Elias looked back at her, and for the first time, he didn't look like a boss or a legend. He looked like a father who had seen his child in pain and had come to make it right. "The bill for this hospital is paid in full," Elias announced to the room. He didn't look at the doctors, but they all nodded quickly. "And my son stays in this room. If a single person even thinks about moving him, they will answer to me personally." Elias reached out and placed a hand on Mia's shoulder. His touch was heavy but warm.
Come, Mia.
"Your brother needs his rest, and you have been a servant for long enough. It is time for you to remember who you really are." As they walked away, the only sound in the hallway was the soft, rhythmic scratching of silk against the tile as Tamok continued to scrub, a broken prince in a world that no longer belonged to him. Mia didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the ICU door, knowing that for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't fighting the world alone. The hallway was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. It wasn't the heavy, scary silence of a hospital at night. It was the silence of people holding their breath because they were witnessing a change they never thought they would see. Mia stood at the center of the hallway, her feet planted firmly on the tiles that Tamok was still scrubbing. She looked down at the gold watch and the leather wallet lying near her boots. They were symbols of a world she had tried to run away from, but now they were trophies of a battle she had finally won. Elias stood beside her, his hand still resting on her shoulder. He didn't say a word, but his presence was like a shield, turning the tired waitress into someone else entirely. Mia looked at the nurses and the doctors. Earlier that day, they had looked at her with pity or had looked right through her as if she were invisible. Now, their eyes were wide with a mix of fear and deep respect. They weren't looking at Mia the waitress anymore. They were looking at Mia Nam, the daughter of the ghost. Tamok stopped scrubbing for a second, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands were red from the effort, and the silk jacket he was using as a rag was now a gray, muddy mess. He looked up at Mia, and the look in his eyes wasn't just fear. It was total, broken submission. He looked like a dog that had been beaten too many times to ever growl again. "Mia," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "This man tried to erase your life. He tried to take your brother's future to satisfy his own pride. The accounts are frozen. The syndicate has turned its back on him. His life is in your hands now. Tell me, what is the daughter of Elias Nam's command?" Mia looked at Tamok. A few hours ago, he had been a giant in her eyes, a monster who could destroy everything she loved with a single phone call. Now he looked small. He looked pathetic. She realized that his power had never been real. It was just a mask made of money and expensive suits. Her father's power was real because it came from the respect and fear of the men standing behind him. "I don't want his money," Mia said. Her voice was clear and loud, carrying down the hallway with a new kind of authority. "And I don't want his life. That would make me just like him." She stepped forward until she was standing right over Tamok. He flinched, pulling his head down as if he expected a blow. "You told me that I was an object," Mia said to him. "You told me that when an object breaks, you throw it away. Well, Tamok, you're the one who is broken now. But I'm not going to throw you away. I'm going to make sure you remember this night every time you look in a mirror." She turned to her father's lead guard, the man with the scarred face who had been watching the scene with a grim smile.
Take him.
"Strip the rest of his family's names from every business in the city. Give his seat on the board to someone who knows the value of hard work. And as for him, let him find a job at a diner. Let him learn how to serve the people he used to mock. If I ever hear that he's been anything less than the hardest worker in the room, then you can bring him back to me." The guard bowed his head. "As you wish, Miss Nam." Tamok let out a sob, but it was a sob of relief. He knew he was being given a chance to live, even if that life was going to be a humble one. Two of Elias's men grabbed him by the arms and dragged him toward the exit. He didn't fight. He didn't say a word. He just let himself be led away into the dark, a prince who had finally learned what it meant to be a servant. Mia turned back to the ICU door. Through the glass, she saw Leo's chest rising and falling. The machines were humming peacefully, and the transfer order had been torn into 1,000 pieces on the floor. She realized that she wasn't the same person who had walked into this hospital that morning. She still wanted to be good, and she still wanted Leo to have a clean life, but she knew now that she didn't have to be a victim to stay good. She looked at her father. Elias was watching her with a look of pride that he couldn't quite hide. He had lost his daughter to the world for 10 years, but tonight, he had found a leader. "You did well, Mia," Elias whispered.
Mia nodded.
She reached up and untied her black waitress apron. She let it fall to the floor, landing right on top of the ruined $5,000 jacket. She was no longer the waitress of the streets, and she wasn't just a shadow in the hallway. She was the princess of the underground, and for the first time in her life, she was ready to rule.